I signed the check for $3.2 million on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, sitting in my architect's office while the rest of the world argued about whether the infection was real. The news anchors called it localized. The CDC called it contained. My architect, a quiet man named Gerald Forsyth, who'd spent 30 years designing Cold War-era government bunkers, called it the end of surface living. I believed Gerald. Let me back up. My name is Ethan Rowe, 44 years old, former defense contractor turned private real estate developer. I made my money building luxury condominiums in cities that didn't need them, selling aspirational lifestyles to people who confused square footage with happiness. I was good at it. I was soulless at it. And when the first outbreak hit Seoul, and the satellite footage showed entire neighborhoods barricaded with burning cars, I didn't call my broker. I called Gerald. I want something no one can find, I told him. Something no one would think to look for. Gerald didn't ask why. He'd been waiting for someone like me his entire career. The site was a decommissioned water treatment facility 40 minutes outside of Asheville, North Carolina, buried beneath 6 acres of overgrown woodland that I purchased through 3 separate shell companies. The facility's original underground infrastructure gave us a skeleton: reinforced concrete walls, deep-set drainage corridors, and a vertical shaft that dropped 90 feet into bedrock. Gerald redesigned everything from the inside out: living quarters for 12, a medical bay, hydroponic food production, water recycling, independent solar and geothermal power, a communications suite, and an armory that would make a small-town sheriff weep. When the world started collapsing, when humans were no longer human, that's when the real fight to survive began. On this channel, you'll experience darkness, fear, and the will to survive. Subscribe now, and don't forget to hit the bell icon. I told no one, not my sister in Portland, not my business partner David Chen, who was still closing deals in Charlotte like the world wasn't unraveling at the seams, not my ex-wife, not my accountant. I routed the payments through a consulting firm I'd set up years earlier for tax purposes, and I hired Gerald's construction crew, all former military, all operating under NDAs with financial penalties steep enough to guarantee silence. The shelter was completed on October 30th. 3 days later, the first case appeared in the United States. Not in New York, not in Los Angeles. In Boone, North Carolina, 60 miles from where I stood in my kitchen watching the breaking news ticker scroll across the bottom of my television. I remember the reporter's face. Young woman, early 30s, standing outside Watauga Medical Center. Behind her, 2 paramedics were wheeling a gurney toward an ambulance. The patient on the gurney sat up. The straps across his chest snapped like thread. He turned toward the nearest paramedic, a stocky man in blue latex gloves, and bit into his forearm with a speed that didn't belong to any sick person I'd ever seen. The camera dropped. Audio caught screaming, then static. Then the network cut back to the studio anchor, who stared at the camera for 4 full seconds before speaking. I was in my car within the hour. I didn't pack sentiment. I packed function: water purification tablets, medical kits, ammunition, encrypted hard drives containing architectural blueprints and financial records, and a single framed photograph of my daughter, Lily, who lived with her mother in Raleigh and who I hadn't spoken to in 3 weeks because I am, and have always been, a coward in the places that matter most. I called her from the road. It rang 5 times, voicemail. I left a message. I'll never be able to unhear myself saying, "Lily, it's Dad. Something is happening. Please stay inside. I love you, and I'm going to come get you. I promise." I didn't go get her. I drove north, through winding mountain roads, past gas stations already running dry and convenience stores with shattered front windows. And I descended into the earth like the selfish, calculating man I'd always been. Except now, the calculus was survival, and the variable I'd cut was my own daughter. The hatch sealed behind me at 11:47 p.m. on November 3rd. The locks were electromagnetic, triple redundant, blast rated. The silence that followed was absolute. I was safe. I was alone. I was beneath the world. And I hated every square foot of what I'd built. The first 72 hours underground were an exercise in organized denial. I moved through the shelter's systems like I was conducting a property inspection, testing water pressure, calibrating air filtration, confirming power grid switchovers between solar reserve and geothermal. I inventoried food supplies, 18 months for 12 people, which meant roughly 15 years for one, assuming caloric discipline and no spoilage beyond projected tolerances. Gerald had over-engineered everything. The man built for apocalypse the way other architects built for aesthetics. I set up the communications suite on day 2. Gerald had installed a military-grade antenna array disguised as a geological survey mast on the surface, shielded by tree canopy and impossible to identify without prior knowledge of its location. It pulled AM, FM, shortwave, and a narrow-band encrypted frequency Gerald had configured for private use. I scanned everything. What I heard was the sound of a country folding in on itself. AM stations out of Charlotte were still broadcasting, looping emergency instructions interspersed with dead air. A shortwave operator out of Knoxville was narrating what he could see from his apartment window. Military vehicles, gunfire, civilians running east along I-40 in columns that stretched beyond the horizon. An FM station in Greenville, South Carolina, played hymns for 9 straight hours before someone keyed the mic and whispered, "They're inside the building. God forgive us." Then silence. I kept a logbook. Hardbound, black leather. The kind I used for project management on job sites. I wrote the date, the time, the frequency, and what I heard. I told myself it was intelligence gathering. It was grief management. On day 3, I made contact with a woman named Miriam Cole. She was broadcasting on Gerald's encrypted channel, which meant she was either military, ex-intelligence, or one of Gerald's former clients. Turned out, she was the third option. "Gerald built my family's shelter in 2019, she said, her voice thin but controlled. "Beneath our property in Hendersonville. He gave us this frequency for emergencies. I've been transmitting for 48 hours. You're the first response." Miriam was 51, former ER nurse, widowed. She was sheltering with her 17-year-old son, Caleb, and a neighbor, a retired electrician named Hank Doss, who had arrived at her door with a broken wrist and a bag of canned peaches an hour before she sealed her own hatch. Her shelter was smaller than mine, designed for 4, stocked for 6 months, but functional. "How bad is the surface?" I asked. "Hank saw them in town before he reached us," she said. "Fast, organized, not like the footage from overseas. They move in clusters." Hank said they responded to sound. He dropped his toolbox running across the parking lot, and 3 of them changed direction in unison, like a flock turning. That detail lodged in my brain. Flocking behavior, not random aggression. Pattern, intelligence, or at least a shared instinct that mimicked it. I asked about Boone, about Asheville, about the roads. "Everything north of I-26 is gone," Miriam said. "National Guard pulled back to Greenville. There's nothing between us and them except trees and time." I didn't tell Miriam about the scale of my shelter. I described it vaguely. Adequate space, adequate supplies. I didn't mention the hydroponic bay, the armory, the medical suite, the 12-person capacity that I occupied alone. I told myself discretion was strategic. Miriam didn't press. She was too disciplined for that. Instead, she gave me her coordinates and asked if I could receive her daily check-ins. I said yes. We agreed on a twice-daily schedule, 700 and 1900, 5-minute windows, encrypted. After we signed off, I sat in the communications room and stared at the wall of blank monitors connected to cameras I hadn't yet activated on the surface. My shelter had everything. Miriam's had a timeline. She had 6 months. I had years. I could help her. I could open my hatch, drive 30 minutes through mountain roads, and bring 3 people into a space built for 12. I poured myself a drink instead, and told myself I'd decide tomorrow. Tomorrow became a week. I activated the surface cameras on day 9. Gerald had installed 6 hardened units in weatherproof housings, mounted in trees and rock faces within a 200-meter radius of the facility entrance. They fed into the monitoring station beside the communications suite. 6 screens arranged in a grid, each one a grainy, green-tinted window into the world I'd abandoned. For the first hour, I saw nothing but forest. Wind moving through bare November branches. A deer stepping cautiously across the access road I'd had bulldozed and then recovered with gravel and leaf litter to mask its existence. Rain beating on the camera lenses. It looked peaceful. It looked like the world hadn't ended. Then, on camera 4, the unit mounted farthest east, covering the old service trail that connected the property to a county road. I saw movement. 2 figures, walking upright but wrong. The gait was uneven, lurching forward with a mechanical insistence, as though the muscles were firing on instructions the brain had stopped editing. One was male, heavy-set, wearing a torn flannel shirt. The other was female, thin, barefoot despite the cold. They moved in parallel, about 10 feet apart, heading south along the trail. Neither spoke. Neither looked at the other. I watched them pass through the camera's field of view in about 90 seconds. They didn't stop. They didn't turn toward the concealed entrance. They kept walking, driven by whatever signal governed their migration, and they disappeared into the tree line at the edge of the frame. I exhaled for what felt like the first time since I'd sealed the hatch. That night, during our 1900 check-in, I told Miriam what I'd seen. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "They've been passing through Hendersonville, too. Hank watches from the periscope. He says they follow the roads, mostly. Like muscle memory. Like they're commuting." "Commuting," I repeated. His word, not mine, but it fits. They walk in the direction of population centers. They follow infrastructure. Highways, rail lines, river valleys. Whatever's pulling them, it pulls them toward density. This was useful. It meant that my location, remote, unpopulated, off any major transit corridor, was statistically safer. The infected were flowing downhill toward cities, following the grooves humanity had already carved into the landscape. I was above the flood line. Caleb, Miriam's son, came on the radio that evening for the first time. His voice was younger than I'd expected. Not childish, but unfinished, the way 17-year-old voices are when they're trying to sound like they're handling things. "Mr. Rowe, my mom says you built stuff before all this, like big stuff." "Commercial real estate," I said. "Office buildings, condos." "So you know about structures, load-bearing walls, ventilation, all that?" "I know enough. Our air recycler is making a sound, like a clicking, every 40 seconds. Mom says it's fine, but Hank thinks the compressor bearing is going." I talked him through a diagnostic sequence Gerald had taught me during my own system orientation. Check the intake filter for debris. Listen for the click with a stethoscope or a glass pressed against the housing. If the rhythm is consistent, it's mechanical wear. If it stutters, it's electrical. Caleb followed every instruction with the quiet focus of someone who understood that the machinery keeping him alive deserved his full attention. Consistent, he reported, every 40 seconds, like a metronome. Bearing wear. It's not critical yet, but it will be within a few months. You'll need a replacement part or a workaround. Do you have spare parts? He asked. The question was innocent, direct. The kind of question a 17-year-old asks because he hasn't yet learned that adults build walls out of implication and avoidance. I have some, I said. Which was true. Gerald had stocked an entire machine shop in my lower level. Lathes, presses, welding equipment, and bins of replacement components for every system in the shelter. I had parts Miriam's shelter would never need, collecting dust in labeled drawers, because I had built a fortress for ghosts. Cool, Caleb said. Maybe we can figure something out. I said goodnight and turned off the radio. The clicking of his air recycler stayed in my head for hours. By day 20, I had developed a routine so precise it felt like self-imposed incarceration. Wake at 600. 30 minutes of calisthenics in the fitness alcove Gerald had insisted on including. Shower in recycled water that tasted faintly of minerals. Breakfast from the rotating pantry. Freeze-dried eggs, reconstituted fruit, coffee brewed from vacuum-sealed beans that would outlast me by a decade. Morning check-in with Miriam at 700. Then systems review. Power, water, air, hydroponic trays, waste processing. By 900, I had nothing left to do. I read. Gerald had stocked a library. Real books, hardcover, spanning military history to philosophy to agricultural science. I worked through Marcus Aurelius and felt the irony like a blade. A Stoic emperor's meditations on duty, read by a man who'd abandoned his daughter to save himself. I put the book down and didn't pick it up again. Miriam's situation was deteriorating in ways she narrated with clinical detachment. Their water recycler was operating at 70% efficiency. Hank's broken wrist had healed poorly. Without imaging equipment, Miriam had set it by feel, and the alignment was off, leaving him with limited grip strength in his dominant hand. Their food supply projections, originally 6 months, had been revised to 5 after Miriam discovered that a section of canned goods had been improperly stored and was showing early signs of seal degradation. "We're fine," she said during every check-in, the way medical professionals say fine when they mean managing. I began drafting supply lists, not for them, for the abstract concept of helping them. I cataloged what I could spare without compromising my own long-term sustainability. The numbers were obscene. I had enough surplus to sustain 3 additional people for over a year without meaningfully impacting my reserves. The hydroponic system alone produced more leafy greens than I could consume. I was composting food while 30 minutes away, a teenager was rationing canned peaches. On day 23, Miriam broke protocol. She called outside the scheduled window at 14:30, her voice stripped of its professional composure. "Ethan." They found the surface entrance. My stomach dropped. The infected? A group, 7, maybe 8. They came up the old driveway. Hank saw them on the periscope. They're standing around the entrance hatch, not moving, just standing. Are they trying to get in? No, they're facing outward, like they're guarding it. That word, guarding, rewired something in my understanding. The infected weren't mindless. They weren't even simply predatory. They were exhibiting territorial behavior. They'd identified a point of interest and established a perimeter around it. Have you made any surface noise? I asked. Ventilation exhaust, generator vibration, anything? The air recycler, the one with the clicking. Hank thinks the vibration might be transmitting through the hatch housing into the ground. A faulty bearing, a mechanical click every 40 seconds, and now a ring of infected standing sentinel above their heads, drawn to the rhythm like moths to a frequency only they could hear. Turn it off, I said. If I turn it off, we lose air circulation in the sleeping quarters. Redirect from the secondary loop. Run the backup fans manually if you have to. But kill that compressor. Miriam was quiet for a moment. I could hear Caleb in the background asking a question I couldn't make out. Then Hank's voice, low and steady, saying something about the periscope. They're still there, Miriam said. One of them just turned toward the hatch. It's pressing its ear to the metal. The image seared itself into my mind. A human figure, degraded and reprogrammed by whatever pathogen had rewritten its neurology, kneeling on the forest floor and pressing its ear to a steel hatch, listening for the heartbeat of the people trapped below. Kill the compressor now, Miriam. She did. The background hum on her transmission went silent. We waited. 5 minutes. 10. They're moving, she whispered, slowly, heading south. I sat in my chair, surrounded by silent, perfectly functioning machinery, and felt the distance between us like a wound. I'm coming to get you, I said. The words left my mouth before my brain authorized them. One mistake, and the entire world changed. Death is everywhere. Fear is everywhere. Would you survive in a world like this? We bring you the most intense zombie survival stories. So subscribe now and hit the bell icon so you never miss one. I spent the next 48 hours planning a surface operation with the obsessive precision of a man who'd spent his career managing risk on construction timelines. Gerald's shelter included a vehicle bay accessible through a concealed ramp on the facility's north face, a feature I'd requested specifically because I knew that total isolation was a fantasy. The bay housed a modified Toyota Land Cruiser. Diesel, reinforced glass, welded steel brush guards, run-flat tires, and a secondary fuel tank that gave it a range of nearly 600 miles. Gerald had sourced it from a military surplus dealer in Virginia and delivered it during the final construction phase. I loaded the vehicle with supplies for 3 additional occupants: bedding, medical equipment, the replacement compressor bearing Caleb needed, 2 months of supplemental food rations, and water purification cartridges. I packed light weaponry, a 12-gauge shotgun I'd fired exactly twice at a range in my 20s, and a Sig Sauer P320 that Gerald had included in the armory with a note that read, "Point, breathe, squeeze. Hope you never need to." I studied the camera feeds for patterns. Over 2 days, I logged every infected sighting within the camera perimeter and mapped their movement times. They passed through in waves, mostly during daylight, trending southward, consistent with Miriam's observation about population center migration. Between 200 and 500, the cameras recorded 0 movement. The forest was empty. The infected, whatever governed their behavior, appeared to rest during the coldest hours of the night. I chose 0300 as my departure time. At 1900 on day 25, I briefed Miriam. I'm leaving the shelter at 0300. I'll take the county road south to Highway 64, then cut east toward Hendersonville through the back routes. I need you to have your hatch clear and your people ready to move. Ethan. Her voice carried the particular weight of a woman who had spent her career telling people things they didn't want to hear. You understand the risk. I understand the math. You have 5 months of compromised supplies, a broken air recycler, and a surface that's learning where you live. I have room, resources, and a vehicle. And 30 miles of open road in the dark. I've mapped the camera data. There's a movement dead zone between 0200 and 0500. That gives me a 2-hour operational window. Hank came on the line. His voice was rougher than Miriam's, seasoned by decades of crawling through attic spaces and splicing junction boxes in the dark. Mr. Rowe, I appreciate what you're offering, but I want you to know something. I'm 63 years old with a busted wrist and bad knees. If I slow you down, you leave me. Nobody's getting left. I'm not asking your permission. I'm telling you the terms under which I'll let you risk your life for mine. You leave me before you leave the boy. Understood? I understood. I didn't agree, but I understood. Hank Doss was the kind of man who'd already made his calculations and found the sum acceptable. He wasn't being noble. He was being practical in the way that only people who've lived hard lives can be. Caleb didn't speak during the briefing. Miriam told me later that he'd sat in the corner of their communications room, knees pulled to his chest, staring at the wall. 17 years old, and already fluent in the language of contingency plans that assumed some people wouldn't survive. I spent the remaining hours before departure sitting in the vehicle bay, engine off, hands on the steering wheel. The ramp ahead of me was sealed. 12 inches of reinforced concrete between me and the November air. Beyond that, 30 miles of mountain road, a world overrun by something we barely understood, and 3 strangers who had become the closest thing I had to a reason for occupying all this expensive emptiness. At 0248, I started the engine. At 0300 exactly, the ramp opened. Cold air rushed in, sharp with pine and decay. I drove into the dark, and the dark swallowed me whole. The first 5 miles were silence and starlight. The Land Cruiser's headlights carved a narrow corridor through the forest, illuminating gravel, fallen branches, and the occasional reflective flash of animal eyes in the underbrush. I drove at 40 miles per hour, fast enough to maintain momentum, slow enough to react. The county road was single lane, winding, poorly maintained, even before the collapse. Every curve felt like opening a door into a room I couldn't see. I passed the first sign of prior human activity at mile 3. An overturned sedan, driver's door open, windshield fractured in a starburst pattern from inside. No bodies, no blood visible in the headlight sweep. Just an empty vehicle and the story it implied. Someone had tried to leave, had been interrupted, had been taken. The sedan's dome light was still glowing, battery draining into the void, a small electric prayer that no one would answer. At mile 7, I reached the junction with Highway 64. I'd expected it to be impassable, choked with abandoned vehicles, military wreckage, the detritus of mass evacuation. Instead, it was strangely clear. Cars had been pushed to the shoulders, some deliberately, others crumpled against guardrails as though swept aside by heavy equipment. A military convoy had come through here at some point, clearing a lane. The asphalt was scarred with tread marks from vehicles much larger than mine. I turned east and accelerated to 55. The highway stretched ahead in long, gradual curves through the Blue Ridge foothills. The moon was 3/4 full, bright enough to illuminate the tree line on both sides. Bright enough to see the figure standing in the median at mile marker 12. I saw it for approximately 2 seconds. Female, mid-30s, wearing hospital scrubs that had once been teal and were now dark with stains I chose not to identify. She stood perfectly still, facing perpendicular to the road. Head tilted at an angle that suggested she was listening to something I couldn't hear. My headlights swept across her as I passed. She didn't turn. She didn't react. She was a statue carved from whatever remained of a person after the infection had finished its renovation. My hands tightened on the wheel. My foot pressed harder on the accelerator. Over the next 6 miles, I counted 11 more, standing in fields, crouched at the edge of the tree line. One was sitting on the roof of an overturned delivery truck, legs dangling, head swiveling in slow mechanical arcs like a surveillance camera. None of them moved toward the road. None of them reacted to the sound of my engine. They were dormant, conserving energy, processing stimuli at reduced intensity, waiting for a signal that hadn't yet arrived. Miriam had been right. They were following infrastructure. The highway was a migration corridor, and these were the ones who'd stopped to rest along the route. I was driving through a sleeping army. I killed the headlights at mile 18 and switched to the vehicle's auxiliary infrared driving lights. Another of Gerald's additions, invisible to the naked eye but sufficient for navigation through the windshield-mounted display. The world turned grayscale and ghostly. The road became a ribbon of thermal signatures, residual engine heat from abandoned vehicles, the warm bodies of infected standing in the cold like candles, the distant thermal bloom of something burning far to the south. I turned off Highway 64 at mile 22 onto a rural route that climbed northeast toward Hendersonville. The road narrowed. The forest closed in. The infected presence thinned. 2 sightings in 4 miles, both distant, both stationary. I was above the migration flow again, climbing away from the gravitational pull of population. At 0347, I saw Miriam's property marker, a stone pillar at the entrance to a private drive, barely visible beneath overgrown vegetation. I turned in, killed the infrared, and rolled the final quarter mile on momentum alone, engine idling. I stopped 20 feet from the hatch coordinates she'd given me, flashed my headlights twice, waited. The forest held its breath. Then the ground opened, and Miriam Cole climbed out into the moonlight with a medical bag over her shoulder and her son's hand in hers. Hank came up last, moving with the careful deliberation of a man who knew his body had become a negotiation rather than a tool. His right wrist was wrapped in a rigid brace Miriam had fabricated from cut aluminum and medical tape, and he climbed the hatch ladder one-handed, gripping each rung with his left while his right pressed against his chest. When he reached the surface, he stood still for a moment, breathing the night air, looking up at the stars with an expression I recognized, the specific gratitude of someone who genuinely believed they'd never see the sky again. "Mr. Rowe," he said, extending his good hand. "Ethan," I said. "Hank." And I meant what I said on the radio. "I know you did." Caleb was already at the vehicle, peering through the windows at the loaded cargo, with the restrained excitement of a teenager encountering competence applied at scale. "Is this all from your shelter?" he asked. "Some of it. Get in. We need to move." Miriam sealed her hatch from the surface using a manual lock mechanism. A deliberate choice, she explained, in case they needed to return. The shelter below would maintain its systems on autonomous mode, a dormant backup, a place to fall back to if everything else failed. Smart. I hadn't thought to suggest it. The drive back was faster. I knew the route, knew the dormant patterns of the infected along the highway, and the approach of 0500 meant we were still inside the dead zone. Caleb sat in the back with Hank, pressed against the window, watching the dark landscape scroll past. Miriam rode shotgun, her medical bag between her feet, her eyes scanning the road with the alert composure of someone accustomed to emergency environments. "3 of them," she said quietly as we passed a cluster of figures standing in a gas station parking lot. "Different postures than the ones near my hatch. These are upright, alert. "It's getting close to dawn," I said. "They're waking up." "Waking up implies they sleep." "I don't think they sleep. I think they cycle. High activity, low activity. Like circadian rhythm without the circadian." She was already theorizing, already applying clinical framework to the impossible. I understood in that moment why Gerald had built her a shelter. Miriam Cole was the kind of person who responded to catastrophe by categorizing it. We reached the access road to my facility at 0431. I drove the Land Cruiser into the vehicle bay, and the ramp sealed behind us with a hydraulic whisper that sounded, for the first time since I'd arrived, like welcome rather than imprisonment. The three of them stood in the bay, blinking under the fluorescent lights, taking in the scale of what I'd built. The bay alone was larger than Miriam's entire shelter. Beyond the interior door, the main corridor stretched ahead, polished concrete floors, LED strips recessed into the ceiling, climate-controlled air that smelled of nothing, which after weeks underground in a smaller space must have smelled like everything. Caleb was the first to speak. "This is insane." "It's functional," I said, which was the defense mechanism I'd been using against my own conscience since September. I gave them the tour. Living quarters, 4 private rooms, each with integrated storage, reading lights, and ventilation controls. The communal kitchen, stocked with equipment that wouldn't have been out of place in a restaurant. The medical bay, which drew a sound from Miriam, I can only describe as professional longing. She ran her hands along the examination table, opened drawers of supplies, and looked at me with an expression that contained equal parts gratitude and accusation. "You had all this," she said, "for weeks." I did. For one person. Yes. She held my gaze for 3 seconds, then nodded and turned back to the supplies. She didn't say what we both knew, that my delay had cost them weeks of degraded living, a poorly healed wrist, spoiled food, and an encounter with infected that could have killed them. She didn't say it because she was disciplined, and because we were standing in the shelter that would save their lives. And sometimes survival requires you to pocket your anger like a stone you'll examine later. Hank found the machine shop and didn't emerge for 2 hours. Within a week, the shelter transformed from a mausoleum into something that resembled a functioning household, which is to say it became complicated. 4 people in a space designed for 12 should have meant abundance. Instead, it meant 4 distinct psychologies colliding in sealed corridors with nowhere to retreat beyond the thin walls of private quarters. Miriam took over the medical bay immediately and expanded her domain into the adjacent storage room, reorganizing my supplies with a system that prioritized triage accessibility over my original alphabetical arrangement. She didn't ask permission. She informed me with the courteous authority of someone who understood that medical infrastructure was not a democracy. Hank occupied the machine shop like a man reclaiming his native country. Within 3 days, he'd repaired his own wrist brace using proper materials, fabricated a replacement bearing for Miriam's abandoned air recycler, in case we ever go back, and begun a comprehensive audit of every mechanical system in the shelter. He presented me with a typed list of 17 maintenance items, ranked by urgency, with projected failure timelines and recommended interventions. His handwriting was meticulous, the penmanship of a man who'd spent decades writing work orders in triplicate. "Your secondary water pump is running hot," he told me over dinner on day 30. "Seal's degrading. I can rebuild it, but I'll need access to the fabrication tools Gerald listed in the maintenance manual." "You found the maintenance manual?" "Bottom drawer of the communications console, labeled Operations Guide. Forsyth." That man documented everything. I hadn't read it. I'd been living in Gerald's masterpiece for a month without reading the owner's manual. treating the shelter like a hotel room rather than a life support system. Hank's quiet competence was a mirror I didn't enjoy looking into. Caleb was the variable none of us had planned for. 17 years old, bright, physically healthy, and vibrating with the particular energy of a young person trapped underground during what should have been his senior year of high school. He adapted to the shelter's rhythms faster than any of us, learning the hydroponic system from the instructional binder Gerald had left, adjusting nutrient solutions, pruning lettuce and herb crops with a careful attention that surprised me. But he also paced. He walked the corridors late at night. I could hear his footsteps through the wall of my quarters, a rhythmic patrol that circled the shelter's perimeter like a watch route. When I asked Miriam about it, she said simply, "He's processing. He does better when he moves." The interpersonal dynamics settled into an uneasy equilibrium. Miriam and I shared the cooking rotation and the communications schedule. Our twice-daily radio scans had expanded. We were now picking up transmissions from other survivors, fragments of voices scattered across the shortwave spectrum. A family in Knoxville. A group of university students barricaded in a dormitory in Greenville. A man who identified himself only as preacher, broadcasting sermons from somewhere in the Smokies, his theological interpretations of the infection ranging from the poetic to the genuinely unhinged. We cataloged them all but contacted none. That was my rule, and it was the first point of genuine conflict. "They're asking for help," Caleb said one evening, after we'd listened to the Knoxville family describe their dwindling water supply. "We have room. We have everything. We have enough for controlled sustainability," I said. "Every additional person changes the math." The math. Caleb's voice carried the particular contempt that teenagers reserve for adults who've confused spreadsheets with morality. "You built this place for 12 people. Capacity isn't the same as operational reality. You came and got us." That was different. Why? Because you already knew my mom? Because she was useful? The word detonated in the silence between us. Useful. He'd identified, with the unfiltered precision of youth, the exact calculus I'd been running since September. I hadn't rescued Miriam out of pure altruism. I'd rescued a nurse, an electrician, and a healthy young person who could work. I'd selected for utility. I'd curated survivors the way I'd once curated tenants. Miriam intervened before I could respond. "Caleb, enough." He left the room. His footsteps echoed down the corridor, then began their nightly patrol. The first test of our collective stability came on day 41, and it arrived not from the surface, but from within. I woke at the 3:14 to an alarm I'd never heard before. A low, pulsing tone emanating from the environmental monitoring panel in the main corridor. I reached the panel in 30 seconds, bare feet on cold concrete, and found Hank already there, reading the display with his glasses pushed up on his forehead. "Atmospheric sensor in the hydroponic bay," he said. "CO2 spike, 1,400 parts per million and climbing. Normal shelter levels ran between 800 and 1,000 parts per million. 1,400 was uncomfortable. 2,000 was dangerous. 3,000 could be lethal over sustained exposure." We traced the problem in 18 minutes. The CO2 scrubber array, a chemical absorption system using lithium hydroxide canisters, had suffered a cascade failure. 3 of the 6 active canisters had been exhausted simultaneously, a near impossibility under normal rotation schedules. Someone had failed to swap them on cycle. That someone was me. The maintenance rotation Hank had drafted included canister swaps every 72 hours, staggered so that no more than 1 unit was offline at any time. I'd been assigned the scrubber rotation because it was physically simple pull the spent canister, insert the fresh one, log the date. I'd forgotten. Not once, but twice. 2 consecutive missed rotations had allowed 3 canisters to expire within hours of each other, and the remaining 3 couldn't compensate for the load. Hank replaced the canisters without commentary. Miriam ventilated the hydroponic bay using the emergency bypass. Caleb, who had appeared in the corridor silently, watched me with an expression that contained no judgment, just observation, the recording of data about who I was. "I'm sorry," I said. "Nothing to be sorry for," Hank replied. "Everything's fixed. But this is why I made the schedule. Systems this complex don't forgive distraction." He wasn't angry. That was worse. Anger I could have processed and deflected. Hank's patient acceptance told me he'd already factored my limitations into his calculations and adjusted accordingly. He'd anticipated that I would fail at maintenance because I was a man who'd spent his life paying other people to maintain things. Miriam pulled me aside the next morning. We stood in the kitchen, mugs of coffee between us, the fluorescent lights casting that particular institutional glow that makes every conversation feel like a performance review. "You're not sleeping," she said. "I'm sleeping fine. Your eyes are bloodshot. Your reaction time during morning check-ins has degraded noticeably over the past week. You forgot the canisters because you're exhausted. And you're exhausted because you're lying awake at night, doing the thing people do when they're carrying guilt they haven't processed." "Thank you, Dr. Cole." "Nurse Cole. And I'm not diagnosing, I'm observing." She took a sip of coffee. "You haven't mentioned your daughter since we arrived." The air in the room changed temperature. I felt it in my chest. A constriction that had nothing to do with CO2 levels and everything to do with the message still saved on my phone. The one I'd recorded on the drive north. The promise I'd broken before I'd finished speaking it. "Her name is Lily," I said. "She's 22. She was in Raleigh when this started. I called her. She didn't answer. I left a message. I drove here instead." Miriam set down her mug. Instead of driving to Raleigh, which is how far? 4 hours, 3 if I pushed it. And you chose here. I chose survival. I told myself I'd go back for her. I didn't. Miriam was quiet for a long time, not the performative silence of someone crafting a therapeutic response, but the genuine stillness of a woman who understood that some confessions don't require reaction. They require witness. "I can't absolve you of that," she said finally. "But I can tell you that carrying it alone in the dark is why you forgot the canisters. Guilt doesn't just live in your head, Ethan. It moves into your body. It takes up space in the systems that keep you functional." She refilled my coffee and left the kitchen. I sat with the weight of my daughter's name in the room, occupying the chair across from me like a ghost. Day 53 brought the signal. I was running the morning scan, cycling through shortwave frequencies the way I'd done every day since arrival, cataloging the slow extinction of human voices across the spectrum. The Knoxville family had gone silent on day 44. The university students in Greenville had stopped transmitting on day 49 after a frantic final broadcast about a breach in their dormitory's ground floor. Preacher still sermonized nightly, his voice increasingly hoarse, his theology increasingly dark. The radio landscape was emptying, and each lost signal was a funeral I attended from a padded chair in a climate-controlled room. At 0738, between 2 dead frequencies, I caught a transmission so clean it startled me. No static, no distortion. A woman's voice, calm, professional, broadcasting on a frequency I recognized from my years in defense, contracting a military emergency coordination channel. "This is Station Ridgeline. broadcasting on FEMA Emergency Channel 7. We are a joint military-civilian installation operating out of the former Pisgah National Forest Ranger Station Complex, coordinates 35.36 north, 82.75 west. We are operational. We are receiving survivors. If you can hear this message, we are 23 miles northwest of Brevard, North Carolina. Approach from the south via Forest Road 476. Identify yourself at the perimeter checkpoint. This message repeats every 30 minutes. I recorded the transmission and played it back 4 times. Then I cross-referenced the coordinates with the topographical maps Gerald had stored in the communications suite. Station Ridgeline was real, or at least the location was. Pisgah National Forest, high elevation, defensible terrain, accessible by limited road infrastructure. The ranger station complex Gerald's map showed was substantial. Multiple buildings, vehicle storage, helicopter pad. A viable military outpost. I played the recording for the others at breakfast. The reactions split exactly along the lines I'd predicted. Hank leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, good hand gripping the bicep of his injured arm. Could be legitimate. Military's been establishing forward operating bases in national forests since the second week. High ground, limited access, natural barriers. Miriam shook her head slowly. Or it could be a lure. We've heard transmissions before that turned out to be recordings on loop. Someone sets up a broadcast, draws survivors in, takes their supplies. A military frequency isn't easy to spoof, I said. Nothing about the old rules applies anymore, Ethan. Caleb, who had been staring at the table, looked up. How far is it? About 45 miles from here. 90 minutes under normal conditions. In this environment, call it 3 hours minimum. We should go, Caleb said. Miriam turned to her son. Caleb. Mom, we're 4 people in a hole. If there's an actual military installation with actual infrastructure and actual other people, we need to know about it. Even if we don't relocate, we need allies. We need a network. We can't just sit here until the food runs out and pretend that's a plan. The room went quiet. Caleb's argument wasn't emotional. It was strategic, and it exposed the fundamental fragility of our situation that I'd been architecturally papering over since September. The shelter was a masterpiece of isolation engineering, but isolation was not sustainability. We were 4 people with finite resources, finite medical capability, finite mechanical expertise, and 0 redundancy. If Miriam got sick, we had no doctor. If Hank got hurt, we had no mechanic. If the hydroponic system failed catastrophically, we had no alternative food source. We were a single point of failure dressed in luxury finishes. I'll go alone, I said. Reconnaissance only. I make contact, assess legitimacy, and report back. No, Miriam said. If you go alone and something happens, we lose our only vehicle and our only route to the surface. I go with you. Hank and Caleb stay with the shelter. Hank nodded. Caleb started to protest, but his mother's expression, the one I'd seen her deploy when clinical authority outranked parental warmth, settled him into his chair. We began planning that afternoon. Departure in 48 hours. The same dead zone window, the same route protocols, but this time with a destination that might be salvation or might be a trap baited with hope. We left at 0300 on day 55. The Land Cruiser loaded with half our standard surface kit and a white flag Miriam had sewn from a bedsheet and attached to a telescoping rod. Universal signal of non-aggression, she said, securing it in the rear cargo area. If they're military, they'll recognize it. If they're not, it buys us a few seconds. The route took us west, away from the highway corridors the infected favored, along Forest Service roads that wound through the Pisgah Range like capillaries. The roads were rough, unpaved in sections, narrowing to single track where fallen trees forced detours into underbrush. I drove at 30 miles per hour with the infrared system active, Miriam navigating from a topographical map spread across her knees, calling out turns with the precision of a surgical nurse guiding an instrument. We saw fewer infected on this route. The mountain terrain funneled them downhill, away from the ridge lines. But the ones we did see were different. At mile 14, two figures stood on a rocky outcrop above the road, looking down at us as we passed. They were motionless, heads tracking our vehicle in unison, like synchronized mechanisms. At mile 21, a group of 5 emerged from the trees ahead, walking single file across the road. They moved in perfect step, each footfall landing at the same moment, a cadence so uniform it looked choreographed. We stopped and waited. They crossed without acknowledging us and vanished into the forest on the other side. "They're coordinating," Miriam said quietly. "That's not flocking behavior. That's marching." The implications of that observation were too large to process at 30 miles per hour in the dark. So I filed it and kept driving. We reached Forest Road 476 at 0437. The road was gated. A heavy steel barrier with reflective strips and a hand-painted sign reading, "Station Ridgeline. Stop. Identify." Beneath it, someone had added in smaller letters, "Weapons safe. Engine off. Wait." I killed the engine. Miriam raised the white flag through the sunroof. We waited. 3 minutes later, a light appeared in the trees to our left. A handheld spotlight, painfully bright, sweeping across the vehicle, pausing on the flag, then on our faces through the windshield. "Step out of the vehicle, hands visible." A man's voice, amplified through a bullhorn, professional cadence, military or ex-military. We complied. The cold mountain air hit me immediately. Frost on the ground, breath visible in the spotlight beam. 2 figures approached from the tree line, both armed with rifles held in low ready position. They wore mismatched clothing, military boots and jackets paired with civilian pants and hats, the aesthetic of organized desperation. "Names and point of origin," the taller one said. Mid-40s, lean, a scar running from his left ear to his jaw. "Ethan Rowe, private shelter, 45 miles southeast." "Miriam Cole, same location." The man studied us, then keyed a radio on his chest. "Gate 2, 2 arrivals, 1 vehicle, unarmed posture, requesting entry for assessment." The radio crackled back. "Copy, bring them to intake." They escorted us through the gate, one walking ahead, one behind. The road climbed for another quarter mile before opening into a clearing that had been transformed into a compound. The ranger station buildings were intact, reinforced with sandbag walls and corrugated metal barriers. A motor pool held 3 military Humvees and a civilian pickup. Solar panels lined the roof of the main building. A water tower stood on a scaffolded platform behind the vehicle storage, fed by a mountain spring that I could hear running somewhere in the darkness. Station Ridgeline was real, and it was functional. A woman met us at the main building's entrance. Late 30s, black, close-cropped hair, wearing a military field jacket with captain's insignia that looked like it had been worn through multiple lifetimes. Her name, she told us, was Captain Denise Okafor, North Carolina National Guard. And she was the ranking officer of what remained of a 60-person unit that had been deployed to establish emergency infrastructure in the Pisgah Range during the first week of the outbreak. "Welcome to Ridgeline," she said, holding the door open. "Let's talk about what you have and what we need." Station Ridgeline housed 37 people. 21 were military, the remnants of Captain Okafor's original deployment, supplemented by 3 soldiers from other units who'd arrived independently over the following weeks. The remaining 16 were civilians, families from nearby towns, a veterinarian named Dr. Russell Kim, who had become the compound's de facto medical officer, 2 teachers, a former IT consultant who managed the communications array, and a cluster of individuals whose pre-collapse identities had become irrelevant in the taxonomy of survival. Okafor briefed us in the main building's central room, a former visitor center converted into an operations hub. Maps covered every wall. Topographical, road, satellite imagery printed before the networks went dark. Red pins marked confirmed infected concentrations. Blue pins marked known survivor locations. Green pins marked resource caches. "We've been operational for 7 weeks, Okafor said, pouring coffee from a dented thermos. "Our mandate was to establish a resupply corridor between Asheville and Greenville. That mandate became moot when both cities fell within the first 10 days. Since then, we've transitioned to survival operations, shelter, defense, resource management, and information gathering." She outlined their situation with a candor that immediately established her credibility. Food supplies were adequate for approximately 4 months, supplemented by hunting and foraging operations conducted by 3-person teams during the infected's low-activity windows. Water was plentiful, the mountain spring alone provided more than they could use. Power came from solar panels and a diesel generator they ran sparingly. Medical capability was limited. Dr. Kim was skilled, but lacked surgical facilities and many pharmaceutical supplies. Their greatest vulnerability was ammunition. They'd been resupplied once by a military helicopter that had landed 6 weeks ago with pallets of supplies and a pilot who told Okafor the command structure east of the Mississippi had effectively collapsed. "No central authority?" Miriam asked. "Fragmented," Okafor said. "Regional commanders operating independently. Some functioning, some not. The pilot said there were holdouts in Virginia, a major installation near Fort Bragg, and rumors of a coordinated zone in the Midwest. But no national command, no chain above regiment level. The information settled into me like sediment. The architecture of the country I'd built condominiums in had dissolved. What remained were nodes, isolated points of function connected by dangerous space, like stars separated by vacuum. "What do you need from us?" I asked. Okafor looked at me directly. "What do you have?" This was the moment I'd been dreading. The transaction. The negotiation between a man who'd built a private fortress and a military officer responsible for 37 lives. I could lie. Could understate my resources the way I'd understated them to Miriam in our first radio contact. I could maintain the illusion of scarcity that had governed my every interaction since September. Miriam was watching me. Not prompting, not pressuring, watching. "I have an underground facility 45 miles southeast," I said. "Capacity for 12. Currently housing 4. 18 months of food supply for full occupancy. Hydroponic food production. Independent power. Full medical bay that Miriam can speak to. Machine shop. Armory." The room recalibrated. I could feel it. The subtle shift in atmospheric pressure that occurs when people who've been rationing learn that abundance exists nearby. Okafor's expression didn't change. She was too disciplined for that. But her posture shifted almost imperceptibly forward, the orientation of someone reappraising a chessboard. "And you've been sitting on this," she said. Not accusatory, observational. "I have. Why come to us now?" I could have given the strategic answer. Alliance building, information sharing, mutual defense. All true, all incomplete. Because my shelter is a coffin with good lighting, I said. Because 4 people can't sustain themselves indefinitely regardless of resources. Because a 17-year-old kid told me that hiding isn't a plan. Okafor allowed the faintest trace of a smile. Smart kid. He is. She stood, walked to the wall map, and placed her finger on the approximate location of my shelter. Here's what I propose. Your facility becomes a secondary installation. Overflow housing, medical capability, resource stockpile. We maintain Ridgeline as the defensive and operational hub. We establish a resupply corridor between the 2 sites. Your people integrate into our operational structure. My people help defend your facility. Mutual survival. Partnership, I said. Alliance, she corrected. Partnerships dissolve. Alliances are built on shared necessity. The integration took 3 weeks to formalize and a lifetime to accept. Okafor sent a team of 4 soldiers to my shelter on day 59. Sergeant Elena Voss, a combat engineer who surveyed the facility with professional admiration. Corporal Trent Nguyen, a communications specialist who upgraded my radio array to interface with Ridgeline's network. And 2 privates, Marcus Webb and Alejandra Santos, who would rotate as security detail on the resupply corridor. My shelter, which had been designed as a monument to one man's self-preservation, became a node in a network. The hydroponic bay was expanded under Caleb's increasingly confident management. He'd studied the instructional binders cover to cover and was experimenting with growing cycles that exceeded Gerald's original projections. The medical bay became a treatment facility. Miriam and Dr. Kim established a shared protocol, with Kim handling Ridgeline's day-to-day needs, and Miriam managing the shelter's surgical-capable space for cases that required more than field medicine. Hank became indispensable in a way that quietly validated everything he was. He traveled between the 2 sites weekly, maintaining mechanical systems, fabricating replacement parts, and training a small group of Ridgeline residents in basic maintenance procedures. His bad wrist had healed well enough under Miriam's revised care to handle light tool work, and he approached each repair with the focused contentment of a man who had found his purpose at the end of the world. The resupply corridor, 33 miles of forest roads connecting the shelter to Ridgeline, became a lifeline. Convoys ran twice weekly during the dead zone window, carrying sowing food, medical supplies, mechanical components, and people. The route was mapped, timed, and guarded by Okafor's soldiers, who established 3 observation posts along the path. It was during the 5th convoy run that everything changed. Sergeant Voss was leading the return trip to Ridgeline when her vehicle was stopped by a roadblock that hadn't been there 48 hours earlier. Not debris, not fallen trees. A deliberate construction. Vehicles arranged in a chevron pattern across the road, gaps too narrow for a Humvee, sight lines blocked by stacked materials. Human engineering. She radioed immediately. Ridgeline Actual, this is Voss. Roadblock on corridor mile 17. Not natural, structured. No visual contact with hostiles. Okafor's response was immediate. Do not engage. Reverse to observation post 2. Hold. Voss complied, and within the hour, Okafor had dispatched a reconnaissance team to assess the roadblock from elevated positions. What they reported dissolved the assumption that the infected were our only threat. The roadblock had been built by survivors, a group of approximately 15 people, armed, organized, occupying a cluster of hunting cabins a mile off the corridor road. They'd been tracking our convoy movements for at least 2 weeks, studying our timing, our route, our vehicle types. The roadblock was designed to stop and redirect, not destroy. A capture mechanism, not a killing field. Okafor convened a meeting at Ridgeline that evening. I attended via radio, Miriam at my side, Hank and Caleb listening from the machine shop intercom. "They're not infected. They're desperate," Okafor said. "And desperate people with weapons and intelligence are more dangerous than any horde." "Do we know what they want?" I asked. "Same thing everyone wants. Food, medicine, shelter, safety. They've been surviving on hunting and raiding abandoned structures. Their resources are nearly exhausted. They saw our convoys and decided we have what they need." "So we share," Caleb said over the intercom. His voice was steady, certain, carrying the moral clarity that I had spent my entire adult life engineering around. "We don't know who they are," Okafor replied. "We don't know their intentions beyond the roadblock. Sharing with unknown actors who've already demonstrated willingness to use coercive tactics is a significant operational risk. Not sharing with starving people when we have surplus is a significant moral failure," Caleb said. The line went quiet. 37 people at Ridgeline, 4 in my shelter, 15 at the roadblock. All of us human, all of us calculating. Okafor made the decision. "We make contact, controlled, on our terms. Ethan, I need your shelter as a neutral meeting site. Can you accommodate that?" "Yes," I said without hesitation. And meant it for the first time since I'd signed Gerald's check. The meeting took place on day 78, in the communal kitchen of my shelter. A space originally designed for 12 residents to share meals, and now serving as a diplomatic venue for the fractured remnants of Western North Carolina's surviving population. Okafor brought 3 soldiers and Dr. Kim. The roadblock group sent 3 representatives. A woman named Ray Whitfield, late 20s, former high school teacher who had emerged as their leader through a combination of organizational skill and the willingness to make decisions no one else wanted to make. A man named Jackson Briggs, early 50s, a former park ranger who knew the Pisgah terrain better than any map. And a young man, barely 20, who introduced himself only as Dex and who watched everything with the coiled attention of someone who had learned that trust was a luxury. Ray sat across from Okafor. Between them on the kitchen table were printed inventories of our combined resources. A gesture of transparency I'd suggested, and Okafor had approved. "We're not raiders," Ray said. "The roadblock was a communication device. We needed you to stop long enough to listen." "You could have used the radio," Okafor said. "We tried. Your encrypted frequency rejected our equipment, and broadcasting on open channels draws infected. We learned that the hard way 3 weeks ago, when we lost 2 people to a cluster that homed in on a handheld radio. The infected were hunting by radio signal, another data point in the expanding catalog of their capabilities." Miriam, standing near the doorway, made a note on the pad she carried everywhere. The negotiation lasted 4 hours. Ray's group had skills we lacked. Jackson's wilderness expertise, 2 members with agricultural experience who could supplement our hydroponic operation with surface farming during safe windows, and Dex, who turned out to be a former college computer science student with an intuitive understanding of communications encryption. In exchange, they needed food, medical attention. 3 of their members were suffering from infections that required antibiotics we had in surplus, and shelter during the increasingly volatile winter weather. The deal that emerged was not a merger. It was an architecture, a distributed network of 3 sites connected by shared resources, communication protocols, and mutual defense obligations. Ridgeline remained the military hub. My shelter remained the medical and supply center. Ray's group established a surface outpost focused on agriculture and terrain surveillance, with access to the shelter during emergencies. 56 people. bound not by ideology or affection, but by the pragmatic recognition that isolation was extinction. I signed no check. There was no contract. There was Okafor's handshake, Ray's nod, and the sound of Caleb opening the pantry to prepare the first shared meal. That night, after the delegations had departed and the shelter had returned to its quiet hum, I sat in the communications room and did something I'd been avoiding for 78 days. I powered on my phone, still charged, maintained by the shelter's ubiquitous power supply, and played Lily's voicemail greeting. Not a message from her. The greeting. Her voice, recorded sometime before the world ended, saying, "Hey, you've reached Lily. Leave a message and I'll call you back." Probably. I played it 7 times. Then I opened the radio, set it to the broadest civilian frequency I could reach, and began transmitting. "This is Ethan Rowe, broadcasting from a secure facility in western North Carolina. If anyone can hear this, we are operational. We have medical capability, shelter, and supplies. If you are in the Carolinas, Virginia, Tennessee, or Georgia, and you need help, we are here." This message repeats every 30 minutes. I programmed the message to loop automatically. It would transmit day and night, a beacon in the static, an open door from the man who had spent his life building closed ones. Miriam found me still sitting at the console an hour later. She read the transmission log, looked at me, and placed her hand briefly on my shoulder. "That's a start," she said. It wasn't absolution, it wasn't redemption, but it was a direction. And in a world without maps, direction was everything. I built a $3.2 million fortress to save myself and discovered that self-preservation is the most expensive form of dying. The concrete walls Gerald designed were perfect. The systems were flawless. The isolation was absolute. And inside all that engineered safety, I was disappearing, becoming a smaller, harder, more frightened version of someone who once believed that money could purchase enough distance from consequence. Miriam taught me that competence is a form of generosity. Hank taught me that dignity lives in the willingness to be useful. Caleb taught me that moral clarity isn't naivety. It's courage the rest of us have been pricing out of our budgets for years. Okafor taught me that leadership means choosing the harder calculation. Ray taught me that desperation and decency can occupy the same body. I still haven't found Lily. The broadcast runs. I listen every night for a voice I'd recognize in any frequency, through any static, across any distance. I don't know if she's alive. I don't know if she heard my message that first night and chose, reasonably, not to trust a father who chose concrete over her. But the hatch is open now. That has to count for something.